I had very high hopes for Season 2 of Barbarians after a solid first installment. Unfortunately, my expectations weren't met in the slightest. I'm going to talk about the quality of the show at the end of this video, but first let's go over its characters and events, and see if they have any basis in actual history. The second season focuses on the events of 10 to 12 AD. To be fair, it isn't the most eventful time in the conflict between the Romans and the Germanic tribes. After their victory at Teutoburg Forest, Arminius' coalition quickly wiped out almost all of the Roman presence east of the Rhine. The Roman populace and high command must have been pretty nervous when the news of the Teutoburg disaster came in. There was fear and uncertainty about what the Germans were going to do next. Fortunately for the Romans, Tiberius had just dealt with the Pannonian revolt and was now free to resume his command in Germania. He came back to the region, made sure that the Germans were not going to invade Gaul, restored the defenses, and just generally calmed down everyone who was panicking after the Teutoburg. After it became clear that the Germans were in no position to go in the offensive, he led a couple of punitive raids beyond the Rhine, but nothing on a massive scale. These aren't really grand cinematic events, but on the other hand, it leaves the writers freedom to focus on more personal stories, politics and intrigue. And that is kind of what they did. It's just they did it very poorly. This season brings back all of the characters who survived the first one, and introduces a couple more. The writers took the saying, "if ain't broke, don't fix it," a bit too literally, so they copied the character types that they already had. We have a very racist Roman, a mildly racist Roman, a girl with a vendetta against the Romans, and a guy who wants peace with the Romans. They also copied the personal conflict of Season 1 Arminius and gave it to two new characters. It isn't all bad. For instance, I thought the portrayal of Tiberius was okay. He's cautious, careful, doesn't get emotional, and values discipline. He utilizes diplomacy to keep the Germanic tribes from uniting, and denounces the actions that might provoke them. This is very similar to the approach of historical Tiberius. He was so cautious and methodical in his campaigns that, according to Paterculus, he managed to destroy the border tribes without any losses. It is obviously an exaggeration, but this kind of reputation does not arise out of nothing. At least the show Tiberius bothered to build a wooden palisade around his camp. It still isn't a proper wall, but it's better than what they had in the first season. Another new historical character, Germanicus, had a completely different style of leadership. He favored show of force, direct engagements and flashy victories. The show goes overboard with his portrayal and depicts him as an absolute psycho. This is a terrible change. It is neither accurate, nor does it make for a compelling villain. Tiberius calls Germanicus a son. This is accurate. By birth, Germanicus is his nephew, but Tiberius adopted him after his father died. During Tiberius' presence in the region, Germanicus was his right-hand man. They actually had spats of a Germanicus' aggressive style, but it wasn't until after Tiberius went back to Rome and became the emperor. At one point in the show, Germanicus disobeys orders of Tiberius and ambushes the Germans during the Thing, the diplomatic gathering where everyone comes unarmed. This is supposed to play in the evil psycho Germanicus narrative, but it isn't completely inaccurate. We know that Germanicus had once attacked the Marsi tribe during the religious festival, so this ambush was not entirely out of character for him. Next we meet Marbod, the king of the Marcomanni. He commands 70,000 warriors, and Arminius needs his help if he wants to beat the Romans. Marbod, however, is not so keen on war. He wants to peacefully coexist with their imperial neighbors, and has proven that this strategy can work. Arminius and Marbod know each other personally, since they both spent their childhood in Rome. This character is based on a historical king of the Marcomanni, Marabudus. Marbod is a Germanic spelling of his name. His attitude towards the Romans is shown quite accurately. He was raised in Italia before returning to his native land and becoming a king of his tribe. His strategy as a king was to avoid direct conflict with Rome and to grow in power outside of the Roman sphere of influence. He even migrated his people east to buy some time before the empire would get to them. The Roman sources show a lot of respect for his abilities as a leader. The 70,000 warriors figure is probably an exaggeration, but it comes directly from the pages of Paterculus' history. What isn't accurate is that the show Marbod knows Arminius from their childhood years. Marabudus was decades older than Arminius and had already left Italy before the Cherusci prince was taken there. Nevertheless, they did come into contact later. Arminius even sent the severed head of Varus to Marbod, trying to entice him into the anti-Roman coalition, but Marbod refused and sent it to Rome. They eventually went to war with each other after the Romans withdrew from the region, but I don't think we will ever get to those events in the show. After first meeting Marbod, we're introduced to another new character, Flavus. He is a brother of Arminius. In the first scene, he spells out his full name, which is supposed to be Flavus Quintilius Varus. We can tell right away that the writers didn't watch my videos about Roman names, or they would know a proper naming convention in case of adoption. They've already screwed up once with Arminius' name. They said that he was adopted by Varus, but his name was Gaius Iulius Arminius. The adoption should have been reflected in the name, and they tried to do it with Flavus, but in his case they got the order wrong. Flavus is a personal cognomen, not a praenomen, so it should come last instead of first. I know there are like 3 people who care about this stuff, but it doesn't cost anything to do right. The guards first ask this Germanic-looking man to provide identification, but then decide not to bother and just let him in without supervision. It's not like they have a recent history of people infiltrating the camp and wreaking all sorts of havoc. The Romans may have built a wall since the last season, but they still aren't guarding the gate properly. In the show, Flavus is fanatically loyal to Rome. He suffers from the fact that he is a traitor's brother. To restore his honor, Flavus wants to capture Arminius. He successfully does so with the help of Marbod, who is, by the way, his lover. But then he is unfairly blamed for Arminius' escape, and Germanicus almost executes him. By the way, you may feel pity for these guards, but if you remember how they let in Flavus without any identification, you can't say they didn't deserve it. Flavus is getting betrayed basically by everyone around him, and in the end is killed while saving Marbod. All of this is obviously fictional. Flavus and Marbod couldn't have met in Rome because of their age difference. What is true to the source is his loyalty to Rome. Tacitus describes an apocryphal meeting between Arminius and Flavus before the Battle of Edistaviso. The two met in the middle of the river Weser. Each of them argued his point of view. Arminius, loyalty to his native gods and people. Flavus, the greatness and benevolence of the empire. Whether this meeting actually took place and the exact words of it are uncertain, but it would have made for some great television. When I first saw Flavus in the show, I was excited to eventually see this exchange put to screen, but the writers decided to do their own thing. Unlike show Flavus, his real counterpart survived the German campaigns, and his son would go on to become the chief of the Cherusci. And then there is a character of Dido. She's a Carthaginian refugee who fled from North Africa to the wilderness of Germania. She hates the Romans because 12 years before the events of this season, they sacked Carthage, and Germanicus personally killed her father. This is of course the most historically accurate character of the show. She is a victim of the so-called Fourth Punic War of the year 2 BC. During this war, Germanicus, who was 11 years old, personally murdered every blacksmith in Carthage. We know about these events from the works of the Roman historian Netflix Adaptus. His chronicles were only recently discovered, but are already being put on the big screen. Thank you, Netflix. Very cool. Very historical. Finally, there is Gaius, a fictional son of Arminius by his fictional Roman wife. Show Arminius didn't even bother to get a divorce before taking on a second wife, huh? Nothing too egregious about Gaius, he's just rather pointless. We've already gone through the same conflict of loyalties with Arminius in Season 1, and with Flavus in this season, so we didn't really need a third character with the same arc. The surviving cast of the first season makes a return. Thusnelda gave birth a couple of months ago, but is already kicking Roman ass and effortlessly pierces armor with a pocket knife. Nothing out of ordinary here, just your typical postnatal Germanic woman behavior. Segestes is also in the story. He's just as pathetic as in the first season. He and his wife are trying to get back into the tribe. At one point he warns Fulquin that the Romans are going to massacre everyone at the religious festival. So Fulquin, who is secretly a super soldier called Captain Germania, single-handedly defeats 50 Romans and saves the day. For his warning, Segestes gets 0 credit. Arminius says that he needs to fight to prove himself, but Segestes doesn't want to, because he is an intellectual. In the end, he sells his daughter and grandson to the Romans and is executed by Tiberius. It takes a dozen Roman legionaries and a threat to her son's life to restrain Thusnelda. Historical Segestes did not go down like a chump. He kept openly opposing Arminius for a long time, and may have been the one to murder him in the end. In the years after the Battle of Teutoburg, Segestes was the one harboring pregnant Thusnelda. Arminius laid siege to his hold to retrieve her, at which point Segestes called on Romans for relief. He did deliver Thusnelda to Germanicus, so this bit is based on a real event. The story of the show Segestes, however, has ended. It became repetitive very quickly and never delivered any good payoff. Rest in peace, Segestes. Those writers did you dirty. Thusnelda's fate in the show is yet to be determined. She is in Roman captivity now, but this woman is a known killing machine, so we can't predict what's going to happen. Who knows, maybe she will go on another rampage and bring down the empire all by herself. To conclude, the character arcs are the biggest problem of this season. Without historical narrative to guide them, the writers seem to be lost, and their attempts to come up with original stories are inadequate. Even the accuracy of the action took a hit this season. For example, during the ambush at the religious festival, the Romans do the dumb Hollywood knock-draw-lose routine. This is obviously a counterproductive thing to do in this situation. You don't want your target to know when you're going to shoot, but the writers watched too much Game of Thrones. A TV show doesn't need to get every historical detail right to be good. Ridley Scott's Gladiator has an entirely fictional plot, but is still a great movie. The Barbarians just suffer from a lack of writer's imagination, inconsistency of its themes, and recycling of the same tropes. Ridiculous stuff like the backstory of Dido and Fulquin's superpowers are just icing on the cake. This season does not hit you on the head with how terrible it is. You just notice one dumb idea, and then another one. Then, a couple of episodes into it, you realize that the plot recycles the same 3 story arcs multiple times, and is very boring. The political narrative that they're going with falls completely flat. I didn't particularly like it in the first season, but there was at least some nuance. Arminius' choice between his native land and the empire that adopted him didn't look obvious. Not every Roman was a raging xenophobe. Varus was genuinely loving and trusting towards Arminius, despite his barbarian origins. It was a decent portrayal of imperial ideology that an outsider can become a Roman by adopting the Roman way of life and by service to the Republic. In this season, all the nuance is gone. The Romans range from very xenophobic to insanely xenophobic, and are all cartoonishly evil. They spend their time twirling mustaches, having camp orgies, and planning to commit atrocities. The Germans, except Segestes, are all good and noble. This is a definition of lazy writing. In the end, they do a setup for a 3rd season. I don't expect anything good to come of it, but there's always hope. The series is not beyond redemption. The actors are still good. The production quality hasn't dropped. If they hire different writers who have some fresh ideas and can write a coherent plot based on real events, I think that the show can be salvaged. I wouldn't, however, bet on it. The audience reception for Season 2 has been mostly negative, so we can't even be sure that the studio is going to greenlight another season. So that's all I have to say about Barbarians Season 2. If you've already watched this season, feel free to share your opinion in the comments. Thanks a lot for watching till the end, and I will see you in the next one.